The night of the 17th of June in the year 1462 smelled of horses, wood smoke, and fear. The Ottoman camp stretched across the Wallachian plain like a sleeping city, tens of thousands of tents glowing faintly in the dark, and inside them slept the most feared army on earth. These were the men who had taken Constantinople 9 years earlier. They had cracked open the walls that had stood for 1,000 years. They had ended an empire that the rest of the world believed could never end. And now they had come north, across the Danube, to crush one small prince who had dared to tell their sultan no. That prince was already inside their camp. He had ridden in through the dark with a column of horsemen, wrapped in Ottoman dress, speaking the language he had been forced to learn as a boy, moving through the rows of tents like a man who belonged there. The sentries who should have stopped him were already dead, taken silently at the edge of the firelight. And somewhere ahead of him, in the largest and richest tent in that field, slept Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror, the man who had made kings tremble from Anatolia to the gates of Belgrade. The prince had come to kill him. Torches flared. A horn screamed into the night. And for the next several hours, the most disciplined army in the world dissolved into screaming chaos as a force of a few thousand Wallachians carved a burning path straight toward the heart of the camp, cutting down janissaries in their bedrolls, setting fire to the tents of the Sultan's own advisors, hunting for one man in the dark. By morning, the field was a charnel house. Thousands lay dead. And the man the whole campaign had been built to destroy had vanished back into the forests as silently as he had come, leaving behind a question that would haunt the Ottoman court for generations. How does an empire that had conquered the unconquerable city find itself, on a summer night, terrified of a single prince from a country most of them could barely find on a map? To understand that, we have to go back. Back before the night attack. Back before the Forest of the Dead that Mehmed would stumble into the very next day, a sight so monstrous that this hardened conqueror would turn his army around and march home. Back to a frightened boy handed over to his enemies as a living promise, and to the empire that thought it owned the entire world. His name was Vlad. History would call him the Impaler. His enemies would call him the devil. And the empire that came to break him would learn that some men cannot be broken. They can only be unleashed. Let us begin with the empire, because to understand the size of what Vlad did, you first have to understand the size of what he stood against. In the middle of the 15th century, the Ottoman Empire was not simply powerful. It was ascendant in a way that felt, to the people living through it, like the working out of destiny itself. For more than a century, the Ottomans had pushed out of Anatolia and into the Balkans, swallowing Serbian kingdoms, Bulgarian tsardoms, and Greek principalities one after another. They had crushed a grand crusade at Nicopolis in 1395, scattering the cream of European knighthood. They had survived a near-fatal collapse when the conqueror Timur shattered their army in 1402, and then, astonishingly, they had risen again, stronger than before. By the 1440s, the only question along the lower Danube was not whether the Ottomans would win, but how much they would take and how soon. And then came Mehmed. Mehmed II took the throne for the second and final time in 1451. A young man of about 19, intelligent, cold, fluent in several languages, obsessed with the ancient conquerors he had read about as a child. The older statesmen of his court underestimated him. They would not make that mistake twice. Within 2 years of taking power, Mehmed did the thing that every ruler before him had been told was impossible. In the spring of 1453, he laid siege to Constantinople, the great walled city that had guarded the edge of Europe for 1,000 years, the capital of what was left of the Roman world. For 53 days, his guns hammered the ancient walls. He had cannons cast so enormous that it took dozens of oxen to drag a single one of them into position. And on the 29th of May, 1453, his soldiers poured through the breaches. The last Byzantine emperor died somewhere in the fighting, and the city that had stood since antiquity belonged to a 21-year-old sultan. The shock of it rolled across the entire continent. If Constantinople could fall, then nothing was safe. To the courts of Europe, Mehmed was no longer a foreign king to be managed with gifts and treaties. He was a force of nature. He began calling himself Caesar, heir to Rome itself, and he meant it. His ambition did not stop at the Bosphorus. He looked north and west, at Hungary, at Italy, at the whole soft underbelly of a divided Christendom, and he believed, with good reason, that it would all be his in time. Between that empire and the Kingdom of Hungary lay a narrow, muddy, much fought-over strip of land called Wallachia. It sat on the northern bank of the Danube, a frontier principality of forests and river plains, ruled by a prince the locals called the voivode. Wallachia was not strong. It could not hope to match the Ottomans in open battle. For decades, its princes had survived by bending, by paying tribute, by sending gold and sometimes their own children south to keep the Sultan satisfied. Was, in the eyes of the Ottoman court, a small and manageable problem. A vassal, a buffer, a place that paid what it owed and otherwise stayed quiet. The man who would change that had been one of those children sent south. Vlad was born around 1431, most likely in the Transylvanian town of Sighisoara, into a noble house with a fearsome name. His father was Vlad II, a Wallachian prince who had been inducted into a chivalric order founded by the King of Hungary, an order dedicated to fighting the Ottoman advance. That order was called the Order of the Dragon. In the old Romanian tongue, the word for dragon was Dracula. And so the father became known as Vlad Dracula, Vlad the Dragon. His son, the boy born to carry on that line, took the diminutive form of the name. He became Vlad Dracula, which meant, in its plainest sense, son of the dragon. It is one of the strange jokes of history that this name, earned by a crusading knight sworn to defend Christendom, would centuries later be borrowed by a novelist and attached to a fictional vampire. But the real Dracula was no creature of the night. He was a child of the borderlands, born into a world where loyalty was a currency, where alliances shifted with every season, and where a prince who guessed wrong did not simply lose his throne. He lost his life, and usually the lives of his sons as well. Vlad's father understood this game better than most, and he played it the only way a small ruler could. He balanced. He owed loyalty to Hungary in the north and to the Ottomans in the south, and he tried, impossibly, to keep both satisfied at once. In the year 1442, that balancing act came due. Summoned to the Sultan's court, Vlad Dracula went south to prove his loyalty, and the price of that proof was his children. He left behind 2 of his sons as hostages. The younger was named Radu. The older, about 11 years old at the time, was Vlad. Think about what that meant for a boy of 11. He was not a guest. He was a guarantee. As long as his father stayed loyal to the Sultan, Vlad would live. The moment his father wavered, the boy's life was forfeit. He spent his most formative years in the heart of the empire that his family had sworn to resist, deep in Ottoman territory, surrounded by the language, the customs, and the casual menace of a court that held his throat in its hand. The 2 brothers responded to that pressure in opposite ways, and those 2 responses would one day put them on opposite sides of a battlefield. Radu, the younger, was handsome, charming, and adaptable. He learned to thrive at the court. He grew close to the people there, eventually to the young Prince Mehmed himself, and he came to see the Ottoman world not as a prison, but as a home. Vlad did not. Vlad watched. Vlad learned. He absorbed everything about how the Ottomans fought, how they thought, how they organized their armies and their fear. But he never bent. The years of captivity did not soften him. They hardened him into something cold and patient and unforgiving, a young man who had learned in the most personal way possible exactly what it felt like to live entirely at the mercy of another. And while the brothers were held in the south, their world back home came apart. According to the accounts that spread across Europe in the years afterward, he invited the old families to a feast and then turned on them. Those he suspected of treachery he did not imprison or exile. He impaled them. This was his signature, the act that gave him the name history remembers. Impalement was a method of execution so slow and so agonizing that it functioned as much as theater as it did as punishment. The condemned were raised on tall wooden stakes and left to die in public view, sometimes for days, a forest of human suffering planted in the open for everyone to see. Vlad used it on traitors, on thieves, on the disloyal, on enemies foreign and domestic, and he used it on a scale that made the rest of the continent recoil. The German pamphlets that circulated after his death, eager to paint him as a monster, claimed victims in the tens of thousands. Those numbers were almost certainly inflated by enemies who wanted to blacken his name. At the core of the reputation was real, and Vlad did nothing to soften it. If anything, he cultivated it. He understood something that the gentler princes never grasped. In a land where the strong devoured the weak, terror was not cruelty for its own sake. Terror was a weapon, and he wielded it like an artist. The stories grew. It was said that crime merely vanished in his lands because no thief could imagine a punishment worth the risk. It was said that a golden cup left at a public fountain went untouched for years because no one dared to steal it. Whether or not those particular tales were true, they reveal something about the figure Vlad had become in the popular imagination. He was a ruler whose very name made men obey. He had taken the lesson of his childhood, the lesson that the world respects only those it fears, and he had built an entire reign upon it. But order at home was only the beginning of his ambition. Vlad had not forgotten where he came from. He had not forgotten the years as a hostage, the empire that had held his life in its fist, the casual contempt with which a small prince like him was treated by the masters of the South. And he had certainly not forgotten the tribute. For as long as anyone could remember, Wallachia had paid the Ottomans an annual sum to keep the peace. 10,000 gold ducats a year, sometimes delivered to the Sultan's court in person by the voivode himself, on bended knee. On top of the gold, the Sultan demanded young boys, hundreds of them, to be taken from Wallachian families and raised as soldiers and servants of the empire, a human tax stripped from the country year after year. For most princes, this was simply the cost of survival. You paid, you bowed, you kept your throne and your head. Vlad had paid it himself in the early years of his reign. He had even delivered the tribute in person. And then, around the year 1461, he stopped. The exact sequence of the breakdown is tangled in the politics of the moment, but the heart of it is clear enough. Mehmed, now firmly in power and hungry to bring his northern frontier fully under his control, sent envoys to Vlad demanding the unpaid tribute and ordering the prince to come south and pay homage in person. He also wanted the boys, the human levy that fed the ranks of his elite soldiers. To Mehmed, this was routine. A vassal had fallen behind. The vassal would be reminded of his place. To Vlad, it was an insult that reached all the way back to his childhood, and he answered it in the only language he believed the empire truly understood. When the Ottoman envoys came before him and, according to the accounts, refused to remove their turbans in his presence as a matter of their custom, Vlad did not let the slight pass. He had the turbans nailed to their heads so that they might never have to remove them again. Whether that particular detail is fact or legend, what happened to the envoys themselves is reported across multiple sources, and it was not subtle. He had them seized, and then he had them impaled. There was no walking back from that. Vlad had not merely refused to pay. He had murdered the Sultan's representatives and announced in the most graphic terms imaginable that Wallachia would no longer kneel. He had drawn a line, and he had written it in blood. Before we move deeper into the war that this set in motion, into the winter campaign and the night raid and the horror that finally turned the conqueror's army around, take a moment to do something for me. Comment down below where you are watching from right now, and tell me what time it is in your corner of the world. I genuinely love seeing how far these stories travel, and how many different places they reach. Drop your city and your local time, and then let us continue, because what Vlad did next was so audacious that it stunned even the empire that thought nothing could surprise it anymore. In the deep cold of the winter of 1461 and into the early months of 1462, Vlad did not wait for the Ottomans to come to him. He went to them. He crossed the frozen Danube with his army and tore into Ottoman territory along the southern bank, through the lands of Bulgaria that the empire had held for generations. This was not a raid for plunder. This was systematic devastation. Vlad moved fast, striking fortress after fortress, town after town, killing Ottoman soldiers and officials and, by the accounts, a great many civilians as well. He burned settlements to the ground. He emptied whole districts. He fought the way he had governed, with overwhelming, unhesitating brutality, and he did it in the dead of winter when no one expected a campaign at all. We do not have to guess at the scale of it because Vlad himself told us. In a letter he wrote to the King of Hungary, Matthias Corvinus, asking for support against the inevitable Ottoman response, Vlad laid out his accounting with a chilling precision. He claimed to have killed 23,884 Turks and Bulgarians, and he noted that this figure did not even include those who had been burned alive in their homes, those whose heads his officials had not been able to count. He was, in effect, presenting a butcher's bill to a fellow Christian king, offering it as proof of his commitment to the war against the Ottomans, expecting it to be received as good news. It is a number worth sitting with, not because the precise figure is beyond question, but because of what it represents. A small prince from a vassal state had crossed into the territory of the most powerful empire on earth and inflicted a level of destruction that no one had dared attempt in living memory. He had done it deliberately, methodically, and he had done it knowing exactly what it would bring down upon him. Because there was no version of this where Mehmed let it stand. The conqueror could not allow a former hostage, a man he had once helped place on his throne, to slaughter his subjects by the thousands and live. The whole logic of the empire depended on the certainty that defiance meant annihilation. If Wallachia could do this and survive, then every vassal from the Danube to the Aegean might begin to wonder what else was possible. Vlad had not just attacked the Ottomans. He had attacked the idea that the Ottomans could not be attacked. And that idea was worth more to Mehmed than any province. So the conqueror raised an army. The exact size of the force Mehmed assembled in the spring of 1462 is one of the great arguments of the period, with contemporary sources throwing out wildly inflated figures and modern historians scaling them down considerably. The numbers the chroniclers gave ranged from 90,000 all the way up to a fantastical 300,000. Mehmed himself reportedly spoke of his force in terms of 15 great divisions. What is not in dispute is that it was enormous, one of the largest armies the Ottomans had fielded since the siege of Constantinople itself. Some accounts placed it at well over 100,000 men, and even the more conservative modern estimates put it in the range of 60,000 and upward. Against this, Vlad could gather perhaps 30,000, scraping together not only fighting men of the usual age, but by the accounts women, older children and contingents drawn from the lowest and most desperate ranks of his society. It was a mismatch of almost absurd proportions. By every measure of the age, by sheer weight of numbers, of supply, of cannon, of trained professional soldiers, Wallachia should have been erased. Mehmed marched north in the early summer, his vast army crossing the Danube, and he brought with him a second weapon that was, in its way, as dangerous as all those soldiers. He brought Radu. Vlad's younger brother, the charming one, the one who had made the Ottoman court his home, had grown into a man trusted by the Sultan, and Mehmed intended to install him on the Wallachian throne in Vlad's place. The plan was not simply to defeat Vlad. It was to replace him with a brother who would bend the knee, a familiar face for the Wallachian nobility to rally around, a way to swallow the country whole and make it look almost peaceful. The Empire had brought both the hammer and the velvet glove. Vlad had no illusions about meeting that army in open battle. He had spent his youth studying how the Ottomans fought, and he knew that to line up his 30,000 against their host on a clear field was to invite slaughter. So he did not. Instead, he did something that required a kind of cold ruthlessness that few commanders in history have ever been willing to embrace. He decided to make his own country uninhabitable. By the time Mehmed's army neared the Wallachian capital of Targoviste in the middle of June, the campaign was already turning into something the Ottomans had not anticipated. They had expected to crush a defiant prince in a few weeks of straightforward conquest. Instead, they were strung out across a wasteland, sick, demoralized, jumping at shadows, telling each other stories in the dark about the monstrous prince who ruled this country, the man who impaled his enemies, the devil they had come to destroy and could never seem to catch. It was into this army on the night of the 17th of June that Vlad walked. The plan he conceived was the kind of thing that should not have worked. The kind of thing that gets a commander remembered as either a genius or a madman, and sometimes both. He would attack the camp at night in the dark with a relatively small mobile force, and he would not fight for ground or position. He would fight for one single objective. He would cut his way through the largest army in the region to reach the tent of Mehmed himself, and he would kill the Sultan, decapitate the empire in one stroke, and the whole campaign would collapse. With Mehmed dead, the army would have no reason to be there, and no leader to hold it together. It was a strike at the head of the snake. To pull it off, Vlad used the very thing his captivity had given him. He knew the Ottomans. He spoke their language. He understood their camp, how it was laid out, where the Sultan's quarters would be, how the soldiers behaved at night. The sources describe Wallachian scouts and even Vlad himself infiltrating the camp beforehand, moving through it in Ottoman dress, mapping the ground, identifying the targets. The years he had spent as a hostage, learning everything, hating everything, had become the foundation of the most daring raid of his life. When darkness fell, Vlad gathered his strike force, by some accounts somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 horsemen, and led them toward the Ottoman camp. Sentries at the perimeter were taken in silence. And then, with torches and a sudden eruption of noise, the Wallachians smashed into the sleeping host. The chronicles describe a scene of total chaos. The Ottoman camp, packed with tens of thousands of men, erupted into panic in the dark. Soldiers stumbled out of their tents with no idea where the attack was coming from or how large it was. In the confusion, with horsemen charging through the rows of tents, with fires springing up, with the screams of the wounded and the dying everywhere, Ottoman units could not tell friend from enemy. There are accounts of the Sultan's own soldiers fighting and killing one another in the darkness, unable to distinguish their comrades from the attackers. Vlad's horsemen drove straight into the heart of the camp, cutting down everyone in their path, burning the tents of the Sultan's high officials, carving toward the center where Mehmed should have been. And here is where the entire history of southeastern Europe hung on a single thread. Vlad reached the great tents at the center of the camp. He attacked them. He set them ablaze. By some accounts, the assassins lost their bearings in the dark and struck the wrong tents, hitting the quarters of the Sultan's senior advisors, rather than the Sultan himself. By other accounts, Mehmed was simply not where he was expected to be. Either way, the result was the same. Vlad burned through the heart of the camp, killed thousands, threw the most powerful army in the region into a night of screaming terror, and yet the one man he had come for slipped through his fingers. As the Ottomans began to recover their nerve and organize a response, as their superior numbers started to tell, Vlad did not let himself get pinned down and ground up. He had never intended to hold the field. The whole operation was a raid, not a battle. He pulled his men back out of the camp and melted away into the darkness from which he had come, leaving behind a field strewn with dead and an army shaken to its core. The casualty figures the sources give vary enormously, from a few thousand to well over 15,000 Ottoman dead, but the psychological wound was deeper than any number. The Invincible Army, the conquerors of Constantinople, had been attacked in their own camp, in the dark, and had been made to feel utterly helpless against a foe they could not see. The night attack failed in its single great objective. Mehmed lived. And in the cold logic of strategy, that meant the raid had not won the war. But it had done something else. It had taken an army that was already exhausted and sick and demoralized, and it had shattered whatever confidence remained. The men who survived that night did not sleep easily again on Wallachian soil. They had learned that the devil could walk into their midst whenever he chose. And the next morning, as that battered army resumed its advance toward the capital, it found the thing that no amount of military discipline could prepare a man to see. The accounts agree on the broad horror of it, even where they differ on the details. As the Ottoman army approached Targoviste, the soldiers came upon a vast field, by some descriptions stretching for a mile or more, and rising from that field was a forest. But it was not made of trees. It was made of stakes. Thousands upon thousands of tall wooden stakes had been driven into the ground, and upon each one was a human body. Some accounts place the number at around 20,000. Many of the impaled were Ottoman prisoners, soldiers captured in earlier fighting, men Mehmed's army would have recognized as their own. Others, by the most disturbing accounts, included women and children. The bodies had been there long enough that birds had begun to nest in some of them. The whole grim field had been arranged, deliberately, directly in the path of the advancing army, a message written in corpses, meant to be read. This was Vlad's true masterpiece of terror, and it was aimed with surgical precision at the one weakness the Ottoman army had left, its will to keep going. He had calculated that a man like Mehmed, who had seen battlefields and sieges and slaughter, could be stopped not by swords, but by sheer horror, by the sight of what awaited anyone who pressed on into the land of the prince who did this to human beings. It worked. The chronicles tell us that Mehmed, the conqueror, the man who had taken Constantinople and called himself Caesar, looked upon that Forest of the Impaled and was shaken to his core. One contemporary account has him remarking that he could not take the country from a man capable of such things, a man who could do this to his own and to his enemies alike. The Sultan reportedly ordered the bodies of those few still clinging to life to be put out of their misery. And then, having marched all this way at the head of one of the largest armies of the age, having crossed the Danube to crush a single defiant prince, Mehmed II turned his army around and began the long march home. Let that stand for a moment against everything we know about the man. This was not a sultan who frightened easily. This was not an army that retreated from much. They had broken the walls of the greatest city in the Christian world, and they walked away from Wallachia, from a prince with a fraction of their numbers, because the cost of going forward had been made too monstrous to bear. The empire that thought itself invincible had met something it could not simply conquer, and its answer, in the end, was to leave. But here is the bitter truth at the center of this story, the part that turns a triumph into a tragedy. Vlad won the Battle of Nerve against Mehmed, and he still lost the war. Because Mehmed had not come north with only an army. He had come with Radu. As the Sultan withdrew the main force, he left Vlad's younger brother behind with troops and with something far more dangerous than soldiers. He left him with an offer. Radu was Wallachian. He had a claim to the throne. And crucially, he was willing to do the thing Vlad had refused to do. He would make peace with the Ottomans, restore the tribute, and end the ruinous war that Vlad's defiance had brought down upon the country. The exhausted, terrified Wallachian nobility, the boyars whose families Vlad had spent years culling, Radu offered something irresistible. He offered an end to the nightmare. And so they began to abandon Vlad. One by one, then in greater numbers, the Wallachian lords deserted the prince who had defied an empire and went over to the brother who promised peace. The terror that had kept Vlad's people in line for years now worked against him, because a ruler who governs by fear has no reserve of love to fall back on when the fear is matched by something stronger. The boyars had never loved Vlad. They had only feared him. And now they feared the endless war he represented more than they feared the man himself. Radu, the handsome brother, the Ottoman court's man, gathered support, and Vlad found his own base of power crumbling beneath him. By the autumn of 1462, Vlad's position had collapsed. With his nobles deserting and Radu consolidating control, the man who had just faced down Mehmed the Conqueror was driven from his own throne. He fled north, into the kingdom of Hungary, to the court of the king he had written to, Matthias Corvinus, the ally he believed would support his war against the Ottomans. What he found there was betrayal of a different kind. Some accounts say he was cut down by enemies in the fighting. Others suggest he may even have been killed by his own men. His head, by several reports, was cut off and sent south to the Ottoman capital as a trophy, proof to the Sultan that the devil of Wallachia was finally, truly gone. And that should have been the end of him. A regional prince, a brutal one, a man who had won a few astonishing victories and lost almost everything else, dead in an obscure battle in a borderland that most of Europe barely thought about. By the ordinary logic of history, Vlad should have vanished into the footnotes, remembered only by scholars of a forgotten frontier. Instead, something strange happened. The very thing that should have buried him kept him alive. The pamphlets that his enemies had circulated to destroy his reputation, the lurid German accounts of the Impaler and his forests of the dead, did not fade. They spread. They were reprinted and embellished and passed down through the centuries, a horror story that refused to die. And more than 400 years after his death, an Irish novelist named Bram Stoker, looking for a name and a homeland for the aristocratic vampire at the center of his Gothic novel, reached back into those old stories and borrowed the name of a Wallachian prince. Dracula. Son of the Dragon. The fictional count has nothing to do with the real man. The historical Vlad was no creature of the night, drank no blood, feared no crosses. He was a flesh and blood ruler in a desperate corner of the world, doing terrible things in a desperate time to hold onto a throne that everyone around him was trying to take. But the accident of the name fused the two together forever, so that today the real prince and the imaginary monster are tangled in the same shadow. And here is the irony that completes the story. The Ottoman Empire that came to crush Vlad, the empire that thought itself invincible, the empire of Mehmed the Conqueror, would go on for centuries. It would expand and rule and dominate, and then, like all empires, it would slowly fade and finally fall. And today it exists only in history books. But the name of the small prince it could not break, the voivode of a frontier principality, the man who made the conqueror turn his army around at the sight of a forest of stakes, that name is known to nearly everyone on Earth. The empire that believed it owned the world is gone. The devil of Wallachia is immortal. In Romania, he is remembered differently than in the horror stories. There, Vlad is often seen not as a monster, but as a national hero, a ruler who, whatever his cruelties, stood against an overwhelming empire when nearly everyone else chose to kneel. The same acts that made him a villain in the German pamphlets made him a defender in the eyes of his own people, a prince who refused to sell his country's children south, who refused to bow, who paid the ultimate price for his defiance. History rarely gives us clean heroes or simple villains, and Vlad is neither. He was a product of a brutal world, and he met that world on its own terms, more ruthlessly and more completely than almost anyone before or since. The night attack on the 17th of June, 1462, did not save Wallachia. Mehmed went home, but Radu took the throne, and the Ottomans got what they wanted in the end without having to conquer it outright. By the cold measure of strategy, Vlad lost. And yet that night, and the forest that followed it, became the moment that the most powerful empire of the age learned the limits of its own power. They had told themselves that no one could stand against them, that resistance was a kind of suicide, that the world would inevitably become theirs. And then one prince, with a fraction of their strength, looked them in the eye, refused to bend, and made even the conqueror flinch. That is why we still tell this story more than 5.5 centuries later. Not because Vlad was good, because he was not. Not because he won, because in the largest sense, he did not. We tell it because of what it reveals about power and fear, about the strange truth that the mightiest force in the world can still be undone by a single will that refuses to break. Mehmed had armies, cannons, gold, and the certainty of destiny. Vlad had a poisoned country, a forest of stakes, and a hatred forged in childhood that nothing could extinguish. And on one June night, that was almost enough to change the entire history of Europe. The empire is dust now. The conqueror is a name in a textbook. But somewhere in the Romanian hills, the story of the prince who made the invincible afraid still lives, carried down through the centuries by the very enemies who tried to bury it. If this story pulled you in, if you want more deep dives into the forgotten corners of history, the battles and the rulers and the moments that the textbooks skip over, then go ahead and subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you do not miss what comes next. There are more stories like this one waiting, stories of the people who stood against impossible odds and carved their names into history through sheer refusal to surrender. Thank you for watching all the way to the end, and I will see you in the next one.